Thank you to the staff and fellows at both ASU and LACMA. It's such an honor to be with you today to discuss, a very difficult subject that's been, on the radar, as of late, particularly with the, unfortunate, murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor back in May. For those of you, who may not know, I just resigned my post at the at the Indianapolis Museum of Art in a very public way, because of the realities, of white supremacy and how as BIPOC museum professionals, we're forced to navigate those realities. And so today, what I'm going to talk about, I've broken it down into two separate sections. So the first section will be points and directives, to the fellows themselves. So it'll be very fellow centered. And then I will follow up with a second section of 3 to 4 points that are directed specifically to LACMA curators and supervisors, and leaders who are supporting the fellows and what you can do, to eradicate and address issues of white supremacy in your institutions, as well as supporting the fellows. So without further ado, I'll get right into it. I'll share my screen. So because we're museum professionals, I thought a really, kind of cool thing to title this is wayfinding, right? The way in which, we have to really navigate, the museum world and navigate our ways, again, through a really toxic culture and a really violent culture, that I don't think museums like to talk about, honestly. But regardless of whether or not, white museum professionals, like to talk about it, it is a very real, reality for so many of us. And so I kind of pride myself as this person who is willing to really talk about it very candidly and directly. So to kind of start us off, I wanted to put up a quote from an essay that I wrote in June, addressing these issues called To Bear Witness, the Realities, real talk about white supremacy culture in our museums. And in order for us to really have a decent, and I think responsible conversation about, white supremacist culture in museums, we have to acknowledge the fact, that the museum was set up, as a space that codified white male identity, right? So if we are talking about, the realities, of white patriarchal supremacy, we have to understand that these are what museums were actually designed to do, right? So, regardless of the conversations and the assertions, right, and expressions of diversity and inclusion and equity and accessibility, museums are actually not designed, to do that kind of work and in a structural, manner. They are actually structured, as a way that bolsters, white male identity and subsequently just white identity, period, particularly in the American context. So for my museum fellows, one of my first questions to you, in deciding to do this work, be it in art history or in museums, is you have to know your why. So you have to know why you are doing this work. What does this work mean to you? Is it something that you really want to do? Is it something that your parents pushed you into? What is your interest? And what do you want to do? So to give you an example of that, like people wonder, or they've asked me recently, about, sort of like the bravery or the courage to resign in the way in which I did in July. And my response is always, my why was always disruption. I didn't necessarily come into the field, to become a chief curator or to become a director. I came into the field to disrupt the American art historical narrative and to disrupt the canon, and to disrupt these issues within museums. So walking away, in the way in which I have, being vocal, about it and about the why, in the ways in which I have, are very unique to my reason, to start this work in the first place. I would encourage you to build your practice, both art historically as well as curatorially around your own integrity. The field will often sort of lay its expectation, on top of you, right? It'll lay the traditional curatorial trajectory. So again, fellow, assistant curator, senior, associate, senior, deputy director, director. And you may not want to go that way. So what is your idea, right, of leadership? Figure out what your idea, of success is. What does success mean to you? Does it mean, major retrospective exhibition catalog, or does it mean, building a community space or a space that really supports the communities that you care about within the institutions? And think about what you need to make those ideas manifest. One thing that I can tell you from experience is that the institutions don't have the tools to give you what you need when your focus is communities of color or artists of color, or even narratives of groups of color, right? So this is something that you have to build for yourself. So if you're interested in, Latinx art, indigenous art, African diasporic art, you have to pull from several different places. And you have to know, what those things are that you need, from art history, from cultural studies, from, visual cultural studies, from critical race studies, right? That will help you, bring your ideas to fruition. And that will also help you later, support, if you're working in contemporary art, living artists of color. The second point of advice is networking. Networking is extremely important. Oftentimes, because the institutions, can be so threatening, so confining, again, so toxic, it is imperative that you build a community for yourself outside of the institution, so to do that, reach out to grassroots community activists, that may be interested in the arts. Reach out to smaller, museum professionals that are in the area, right? You guys are in LA, so there are, I'm thinking about the people at CAM, I'm thinking about the cultural studies faculty at UCLA and USC, some of the community colleges. I'm thinking about the library, and archival professionals that are in the area that can really serve as this sort of surrogate safe space, for you that is still within the field, but adjacent, right, to the institution, not the institution itself. Those are spaces, you need those spaces, so you can actually have the intellectual conversations that you want to have. Because a lot of times I know you all, maybe feeling singularly, you are reading things and, working from frameworks that not a lot of people, within the institution itself, have worked from, or even so, to give an example, like I say all the time, right, I'm a critical race culture historian. And when I arrived, in Indianapolis, there was no purview to what critical race theory even was, to the point where people thought it was my idea, it was something that I had come up with. So people had never heard of Kimberly Crenshaw or Saidiya Hartman, or Nicole Fleetwood, or any of the other, critical race scholars, that I model, myself after, or the traditions within scholarly traditions, within which I was working, right? And that was really hard for me, when I first arrived there, because that was not something that I was expecting. And it was my community at IUPUI and IU and Purdue and DePaul, and Butler, at the other schools, that really helped me through the cognitive dissonance, of being, a curator at an institution, doing this kinds of work that literally, only a handful of my colleagues had any, purview for. And none of, my senior leadership, didn't have any purview for it at all. So hence my resignation. The second point would be to work with colleagues within the institution So not everybody, is against you, clearly. Not everybody is a challenge, and not everybody is toxic, right? So work within, or I would say, work within the community, work within the institution, to build a safe space. You have to find pockets for yourself, so if there's somebody in registration, if there's someone in conservation, if there's, people in education, right? Build those relationships. One, it makes it easier when you're working on your own projects, to collaborate with people. These were relationships, that you will take with you, and as you move further in your career, people really invest in people, so building the relationships is just as important as researching the objects. I say all the time, my curatorial practice really centers people, and not objects. A lot of my opportunity, has come through the people, right, that I've gotten to know, built relationships with at my institutions versus the actual shows, and programs that I put together. For museum curators, shifting gears, to the next section. For you all, some of what I'm gonna say is gonna be really hard to hear. Not, I think as a whole, in the arts, particularly in art museums, we don't like to think of ourselves as racist, sexist, classist, maybe elitist, maybe that's something that we will actually claim, right? But we don't always like to think about, again, the realities, and particularly white museum professionals, right? The reality of your positions as white people in white institutions, and what that means and the consequences and repercussions and the realities of that, for your Black and brown colleagues, as well as, Black and brown subordinates. So one of my first points of advice to you would be to be a good manager. Management does not come naturally to people. If that is something that you are struggling with, take responsibility for that, and get the training and the resources that you need to be a good manager. Being a good art historian does not necessarily translate into being a good supervisor. And as a supervisor, it is your responsibility as a leader, right, to ensure that everybody under your supervision has the resources that they need to thrive, not to survive, not just to, be successful on this one little project, but to thrive in the ways in which they want to direct and build their own career path, right? And particularly for graduate fellows, they are not your curatorial assistants, they are not there to get you coffee and write your labels. They are there to learn the best practices, from you, and ways in which they can bring their own ideas, to fruition. So you may not necessarily be an expert in African diasporic art, or an expert in, Latin American art or indigenous art, right? Or other areas of art history that they may be interested in, but you are a curator, right? And so there are certain like base level, sort of foundational level things, that you can offer, these fellows, without necessarily being an expert in the same area of art that they are interested in. To give you an example of that, so during my first fellowship at the Birmingham Museum of Art, my goal again, was to disrupt, right? So I wanted to really apply critical race theory to the American art historical narrative. And that was something that was unique to me. But how to put a show together, how to put a reinstallation together, in order to do that was not. And in that moment, when my colleagues around me realized that was what I wanted to do, and reading the works that I was looking at in the collection, the head interpreter, the head registrar, and the then curator of American art, Graham Betcher, who is now actually the director down there now, got together with me and they said, Kelli, we're going to give you the skills that you need in regards to putting an actual show together. So going from concept in a work, to an actual project. And I did a month, of really deep study, and really deep hands-on training with every department, in the institution. So how to take an idea, again, from just here's something that I see in this particular painting, to a full-fledged exhibition. So going into the next point, taking responsibility, for your position, as a curator, to walk the fellows through that. And then on a more personal level, acknowledging within yourself, have there been any racial transgressions that you have perpetuated or been a part of, right, that you need to apologize for, right? Doing that, and doing that and being very deliberate and direct in that, acknowledging your blind spots, what are ways that you see race, right? I think, and I may send this out to people, but there is a diagram of like the white supremacy pyramid, right? There are different levels, in different ways and various nuances, right, in how racism or white supremacy, anti-Black and brownness functions. So just because you aren't necessarily using, some sort of negative epithet, or the Klan isn't like, marching around your office, it doesn't mean, right, that white supremacist violent things are not happening, to fellows and other BIPOC professionals. So acknowledge the ways in which you can totally see, racism and white supremacy in the ways that you may not be able to. Once you do that, do not burden, BIPOC fellows with your guilt, even in apologizing, right? And don't burden them with your ignorance. And I don't mean that to be, negative or disrespectful, but if there's something that you don't know, we have our great friend Google, and in, this socio-political moment, you can Google critical race, syllabi, you can Google reading lists, you can Google tons of articles, and kind of start, and even, reading groups, in different groups on social media that are having these conversations. It is not their job, to absolve you, right, of your bad feelings or guilty feelings. And it is also not their job to teach you. They are not there as anti-racism activists, right? They are not there as DEI, trainers. They are there as art historians, and so just because they are people of color, does not mean that they are in these spaces, to help you better understand people of color. That is you in your responsibility and only your responsibility. So here's another quote, from my essay about that, this whole idea of how do we move forward from this space. I call this the built-in hamster wheel, so we're in this moment where it's like, well, what are best practices and what are there to do? The maps exist. People like Portia Moore, have written about this stuff, for years. I think Portia's just really one of the most recent. You can get a edited volume called Reinventing the Museum, where there are several different museum professionals going all the way back to the turn of the 20th century, who have written about ways forward, and again, best practices, solutions, to this issue. The issue is really not the problem, I would say. I would say is our inability, right, to address it. And to a large degree, white museum professionals and white leadership's refusal, to address it. So again, in doing that research, reach out and look, for yourself for ways that, or for the maps, and for the materials that walk you through how to implement what best solutions are. My last point of advice would be to speak up and speak loudly. Speak up in the moment that a racial microaggression is happening, something that just, I understand why, white folks will do it, but it doesn't make it any less burdensome, for the person of color, and for myself in these moments, where the racial microaggressions happens, right? Or the racist thing is said in the meeting, and the person of color in the room speaks up, and nobody says anything. Nobody says anything to support that person. Nobody says anything, even in objection, right, to the racist, sexist, thing that may have just been said or even done in certain cases. And then after the fact, that maybe later on in the day, or the next day, you go to the person, the BIPOC person that spoke up in the meeting and say, thank you so much for saying that, right? Or I was thinking that, and I just, oh my God, I just can't even, like, no. Like all of that, can be prevented. If it was something that you were thinking in the moment, you could have also said something in the moment. Which leads me to the second point, white privilege affords you the privilege to be silent, the privilege to not say anything. Myself, these fellows, other BIPOC, professionals or people, right, in the room are not always afforded that privilege. And so silence in those moments isn't just a choice, it's complicity. So coming to me or coming to the person of color after the fact, to say thank you. When majority of the time, the person of color was not necessarily speaking up to save you, or to defend you even, they were speaking up to defend themselves, right? Or defend their communities, the people that they represent, the artists that they care about, from the racist statement. That kind, of approach, to these issues is very, very problematic, and so it would behoove you, to really learn, how to not do that, and how to use your position, to move to the last point as white curators to actually protect the fellows. So in those moments where those things are happening, right, where these racist microaggressions are happening, not just saying something, but being proactive enough, to protect a fellow from even being in the room, right? We know, just like we know, as BIPOC museum professionals, right, who the white male or even white female problem children are, so do you, and you can use your positions, right, to protect fellows, and even protect your BIPOC colleagues, from those individuals. Don't schedule the meeting, or don't require, fellows to be in meetings with people that are inherently racist, right? Or people that are inherently sexist or have gender biases or sexuality biases or what have you. You as curators, can actually work and serve, as a buffer, to those, types of interactions. So a lot of times you can prevent this stuff from happening to your BIPOC colleagues and the BIPOC fellows, more so than or something. I would be, really frank with you, more so than, sometimes you may be willing to do. Right. But this is what is necessary. If we are going to move forward, as a field, in a genuine, and building a genuine culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, this is what has to happen. It's not the only thing that has to happen, right? But you have to start somewhere, and it has to start with white people. Black and brown people have been fighting these fights and saying these things our entire lives, right? Our entire careers. We were born into this. This is something now that is really, and I work really hard, right, to put the responsibility back on, particularly white curators, because oftentimes we're talking to a leadership, that really doesn't care, about this stuff in the first place. A lot of times we are token hires, right? We are the diversity hires, right? We're just there to check the diversity box. You on the other hand are not. So there's so much more, that you can be done. And if you hear, myself, people like Latanya Autry, or other curators talking about this practice of care, this is what we mean. And I will end, with this Angela Davis quote that really informs, how and why, I do the work in the ways in which I do, and the how and why I talk about this stuff in these ways is because as a person of color, particularly as a Black woman, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Which is every day. It's not something, that I just put on and take off, as I move in and out of museum spaces. You know, it's something that I do all the time. It's something that the fellows are doing all the time, you know, whether you realize that or not. And it's your job, you know, as leaders, you know, and as colleagues of these fellows and as mentors, you know, to ensure that they have everything that they need to transform the worlds in which they live in. Thank you.